Good morning, everybody. Christina Previtt here. I am the lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. You guys saw me on Christmas Day talking about all things Jerry PT, but now I'm switching hats for Fitness Athlete Friday. So if you guys are looking to, if you do work with pregnant or postpartum athletes, which I would argue if you're seeing women in their 40s to 50s, you're seeing women who are postpartum and they want to get back to fitness, then you should consider taking the next online cohort. It's 8 weeks. We start January 13th. So I encourage you guys to take my course. I co-lead the course with Kelsey Valentine, who's an internal pelvic floor therapist, though this course is not specifically designed for people who are internal therapists. It's teaching you what you can do if you are a non-internal therapist, though we do get a nice mix of people who do internal and those who don't. Okay, so you guys have heard me talk around the pelvic health space, around how we have had a lot more awareness about all things pelvic floor, especially in the last 5 to 8 years, which I think is amazing. So many people do not realize that our pelvic floor is actually a muscular system that helps to support our pelvic organs. And with that increased awareness, many women are seeking conservative treatment, and the research on conservative treatment to be treating things like stress incontinence, urge incontinence, and pelvic organ prolapse is actually fairly good. However, with an increased awareness can be this huge pendulum swing where we can be creating a lot of fear with the way that we are communicating. So let me explain. When I am working with a fitness athlete, or even in my own postpartum journey, I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of the pelvic anatomy. I was being treated by an internal therapist with Kelsey, who co-teaches the course with me. And I had the resources to understand what I should be avoiding in pregnancy, when I should be regressing my exercises, how I should be breathing, how I should be managing pressure, etc. And that continued as I started building up again in the postpartum period. And for an example is I post a lot of my journey online on Instagram, hashtag be about it, where I'm posting that I am starting to get back to things in the early postpartum period. In the first 12 weeks, I was starting to do things like no feet muscle snatches and very light snatch work where I'm eliminating the impact by doing no feet. And I believe that people were trying to be extremely helpful. I have to believe that people were being helpful, but they created a lot of fear and hypervigilance in me, even with the amount of knowledge that I had. I had people message me saying, how can you be lifting? Aren't you afraid you're going to kill your baby via miscarriage? When I was in I was 36 or 37 weeks pregnant, and one, I knew that was absolutely not going to be the case, but imagine the amount of fear when somebody is almost insinuating that I am putting my baby at risk, or that I am going to some way harm or cause a stillborn birth, like horrible things to say to somebody, even though I do believe that they were trying to be helpful. And then when I was coming back to things postpartum, I was asymptomatic. I was being checked regularly internally for any prolapse or anything like that. And I had people who asked me for my vaginal biofeedback numbers so that I could almost prove to people online that I was healthy in order to be able to come back. And again, I really do believe that those types of comments were said to be helpful because they had experienced similar things, like they had returned too quickly and ended up with symptomatic prolapse symptoms, for example. But what it created in me was this sense of hypervigilance around my pelvic floor, to the point where there was a good couple of months where I could not do any sort of activity or exercise without thinking about my pelvic floor. And sometimes that's beneficial when you're going through rehab for anything. For example, if you're rehabbing a shoulder injury and you're trying to get back to kipping pull-ups, you're probably internally monitoring your shoulder as you're hanging from a bar, or as you're trying to get into the back end of that swing, or when you're trying to initiate the pull, especially if previously that those were movements that were painful. But sometimes hypervigilance can go against you, where you can almost exacerbate any symptoms in your mind, or you can be unsure if these are symptomatic versus not symptomatic. I started thinking, like, was this something that was me leaking, or was it just that I was hot, or was it just normal vaginal discharge that is something that we women experience all the time when we're working out? And I got to the point where I was unsure of my own anatomy, and things that when I was thinking about pre-pregnancy or pre-baby, these would be things that would never even have crossed my radar when I was working out, because I never experienced any issues. And this does not necessarily have to be just for the postpartum athlete. It can be for the athlete who's experiencing stress urinary incontinence, where the messaging that we deliver has to be carefully thought out. So I battle back and forth between the way that we communicate risk, and we talk about this a lot in the Jerry PT world. So this is essentially a good parallel between how we're expressing falls risk. So when I'm thinking about working with somebody who's over the age of 65, and I go through an assessment and I've identified that they're at risk for falls, I am not going to say to them, you have to be really careful. You could fall, and falls could lead to increased risk of institutionalization and death. Because, and you guys are probably thinking, like, of course, Christina, I wouldn't say that. But sometimes that is the way that falls risk is communicated. And we know that it can create hypervigilance and fear of movement. In the postpartum world, that can happen the same way. So there are people who will say, you know, you shouldn't be running, or you should never hold your breath when you're starting to lift weights. And it creates this fear about doing things like Valsalva, which we know is very, very common after 80% of our one repetition maximum. So just like we wouldn't tell an older person who has a falls risk that you could die if you fall, we have to start thinking about the way that we're communicating risk and communicating when it comes to return to sport for the postpartum fitness athlete. So the biggest concern largely with heavy weightlifting is around the risk of developing a pelvic organ prolapse, which is the descent of some of the organs in the pelvic system into the vaginal canal. And if we return to heavy lifting, there is a risk that we can exacerbate descent, or we can become symptomatic and have symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse. And what we know right now is that many people, almost everyone after having a baby, it's like degenerative disc disease, and I've talked about this before, will have at least a grade 1, to the point where people are almost saying that a grade 1 shouldn't even be a diagnosis of a pelvic organ prolapse, because it pretty much happens to everyone who has been pregnant, especially if you've had a vaginal delivery. So when we're talking to our women who want to return postpartum, we have to communicate effectively that there are certain things that should be on our radar, that if you're starting to feel these symptoms, they are information for us that it may be time to slow down, or that we may not want to increase our weight that day. So things like talking about, if you are lifting a heavy weight and you're starting to leak urine, that is not something that is like a death sentence for your ability to lift heavy weights. It is information, just like if you start doing overhead movements with shoulder pain and you were originally pain-free and you start experiencing pain with kipping, okay, that's probably exceeding your body's capacity and threshold for that day. It is information, especially if that pain increases above a 3 out of 10. For some women, for example, if they have a little bit of urine leakage, they are completely fine with that. I don't need to wear a pad. It's just a little bit. But if it starts to get to the point where you're having more of a flow of urine when you're lifting weights, then that's probably the cue or the trigger for us to step back in terms of the intensity of that workout for today, until we come the next day and manage that fatigue and recover. When we're thinking about hypervigilance, oftentimes we're talking about it in the chronic pain literature. So with Justin Dunaway's 8-week course on persistent pain, he does an amazing job of explaining how we can form these conversations so that we're not creating this loop where we're using that pain neuroscience education to help when people are experiencing symptoms of chronic pain. But in the pelvic floor world, pain often, not always, isn't necessarily the biggest a factor for seeking care, right? When we're thinking about incontinence, we're thinking about urine leakage. When we're thinking about pelvic organ prolapse, you can have lower abdominal pain, but it's often heaviness, drag, this feeling of openness in the vaginal area. Sometimes when it's particularly severe, we may have to splint in order to have a bowel movement, and that is usually the trigger for us to be seeking care. So when it comes to working with a postpartum fitness athlete, we have to be very conscious about framing our conversations, because we can have women who are completely asymptomatic, who are now told that they have a grade 1 pelvic organ prolapse, who all of a sudden start developing a lot of symptoms in line with pelvic organ prolapse that they never had been experiencing before. And it makes me question, like, was that because something has progressed, especially if they're still on internal exam looking that they have a grade 1 prolapse? Or is it because our communication style was not necessarily the most beneficial to be helping our client? So in order for us, kind of coming back, when we're thinking about the way that we're communicating around stress incontinence, urge incontinence, any type of pelvic organ prolapse issue, we have to be aware about what the symptoms are. We're not negating information to our clients. We're giving them, okay, if you are starting to experience this, or this, it's probably a trigger, or it's probably that your body has done too much and it's fatigued for today. We're going to take a step back. We're not going to say, if you're starting to experience this, it's probably because your pelvic organs are starting to come out or descend further, because just think about how fearful that can be when you're thinking, oh my goodness, like my bladder may come out of my vagina. Like, it's fearful. And so discussing what we need to be aware of, being open and honest with our clients around, when it's a trigger to progress, when it's a trigger to scale back, is going to be important. But I think the way that we're framing those conversations is going to be extremely important, because there are more women who are pushing that boundary. And there is more research being done that people who are lifting heavy weights don't necessarily have a higher degree of pelvic organ symptomology or grade of prolapse compared to those who are completely sedentary, or those who are doing yoga and walking, which tends to be the traditional recommendation for exercise, especially in the early postpartum period. And so, the way that we are framing our communication should very closely mirror the way that we would think about pain neuroscience education for individuals who are in chronic pain. And therefore, I'm still not 100% great at this. I'm still working on it. I'm always a work in progress, but definitely trying to be realistic with what we're seeing on our objective and subjective exam, and using that information to help guide our clients without thinking about trying to create that hypervigilance. Because if we are thinking, for example, with pelvic organ prolapse, that our organs are going to come out, then we may actually have a hypertonic pelvic floor situation happen down the road, where we are almost too tight in our pelvic organs, our pelvic floor muscles, and that is going to create some symptoms as well. So it may not necessarily be that, that hypervigilance can actually increase our symptoms in a physiological way as well as in a pain neuroscience type of way. All right, I hope you guys found that helpful. Communication is probably one of the hardest things that we as PTs have to try and master. We are always a work in progress, and sometimes I finish having a conversation and then I think, oh my goodness, that probably didn't go as well as I would like it to, and I reflect on those types of conversations. But every single time we do a rep, we get better at it. And every single time we talk with our clients, we have the opportunity to affect them positively or negatively. And I take that as a big responsibility, especially when I'm working with, when I'm working with anybody. But with my fitness athletes, I understand how that postpartum journey is really overwhelming. And there's a lot of information, and people can try and be helpful, but can actually create a lot of fear when you already have a lot of fear around transitioning back into exercise and being a mom or a mom again. And so, I really think about my communication style when I'm trying to discuss some of these symptoms. All right. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful Friday. I can't believe it's already Friday with the holidays being in the middle of the week. I don't even know what day it is. So I'm very glad that I remembered that I'm on here on Friday. So if you guys have any questions, if you guys have had any experiences the same way where you had a lot of fear of movement after having a baby or while you're pregnant, I hope you guys can comment below because these stories are really powerful in terms of the impact that they can have. So I hope you guys can post them below. Otherwise, I hope that you guys consider taking the 8-week online course for clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum. We start January 13th, which is not that far away. And other than that, I will probably see you guys in a couple of weeks as I'm back on the podcast. Bye, guys.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.